All right, to this now. The South African Post Office is warning of liquidation if it does not receive a 4 billion rand bailout. The ailing parastatal's management appeared before Parliament's Portfolio Committee on Communications. The entity has been under business rescue. And let's try and get some detail now around this. And we speak to the committee chairperson, Khusela Sangoni, tonight. Ms. Sangoni, good evening to you, and thank you for your time. Are you aware of this impending disaster? And I call it a disaster because there have been many attempts before to try and make sure that the South African Post Office stays afloat.
Well, good evening, Oli, and thank you so much for inviting us onto the program. Yes, as you indicated, the Portfolio Committee on Communications met with the South African Post Office yesterday. We were expecting the business rescue practitioners, however, we did receive a presentation from management. Now, as you're saying, there's an imminent disaster, according to the report that we received, that within the next couple of weeks, in fact, by October 2024, the post office will run out of cash reserves, which allow it to continue with its operations. Now, as the portfolio committee, I think that we were quite perturbed, firstly, by the very short notice that is given in this regard, but secondly, by what we considered a lack of a very aggressive, a very ambitious, a very strong, innovative plan that speaks to how the business rescue practitioners would have sought to implement a turnaround plan for the post office. So we, in discussions, we've called upon Minister Malatsi as well as the Minister of Finance to engage around this issue of the cash injection to the post office. And we understand that the National Treasury, and rightly so, has put in certain conditions towards the funding of the post office, and some of those obviously include, being able to pay creditors timely in line with the business rescue plan, ensuring that the organization is viable and sustainable, which obviously requires a long-term sustainability plan. And I think these are the issues that we are raising with the business rescue practitioners to say, as the portfolio committee, we are not yet at this point convinced that that long-term sustainability plan is there. We're not seeing any attempt to firstly protect, but also grow the post office revenues, and also really for the post office to adapt and future-proof itself to ensure that it is indeed a post office of the future that is able to sustain itself in the long term.
Yeah, I just want to quote briefly, Ms. Sangoni, the statement from the acting CEO of the post office, who says, and I quote now, "All jobs will be lost. Business operations will cease, save only for those operations necessary to wind up the company. All assets will be sold for, or rather at forced sale value. Any proceeds will be divided amongst creditors." What is the department saying about a possible bailout here? 4 billion is what is being asked for.
Oli, we've been here before. And I think maybe firstly, let's acknowledge and even applaud, I think, the department for the strides that it took when it took the decision to put the post office under business rescue rather than, comply with that provisional order that had been issued against for liquidation of the post office. Now, what we had expected, obviously, was that the business rescue plan itself, or the business rescue process, would then seek to ensure that the organization is turned around, it's operationally restructured, and it has a plan moving into the future. There have been some positive improvements that have been made. I mean, if you just look at its historical debt, it was sitting in excess of 8.7 billion. And I think at the end of the 30th of June, that was down to about 400 million. Unfortunately, it came at a very great cost to the organization, to staff, to communities, because about 600 branches of the branch network of the post office had to be closed down. And as we know, about 4,000 employees were laid off. So we need to build on that. And I think this is the conversation that we're having with the department to say there are opportunities that the post office should leverage on and leverage on quite quickly. I think the pressing priority now is to ensure that they conclude those discussions with the National Treasury and ensure that this so-called doomsday scenario is not realized in October. But the conditions are quite stringent. But as I said, I believe that they are reasonable. They also need to ensure that their revenue base is expanded. And a quick win in that regard is to ensure that they speak with their counterparts in government, to ensure that government-to-government business is expanded. The post office's exclusive license for the delivery of all mail that is less than a kilogram, and I think that should be renewed, because that at least ensures that there's a niche market that the post office has there. And then we need to support the post office. I mean, it's got a very huge property portfolio that, if it was leveraged appropriately, would be able to also bring in revenues to the post office. And there's nothing you can do then in this environment of rapid technological change without seeking to leverage, I think, digital transformation in the post office. They can easily, I think, strengthen their logistics capacity to be able to provide services to your e-commerce, your retailers, and those type of partnerships. So we're saying that this is what we want to see in the post office, that while National Treasury is in discussions with them, it cannot continue to have an organization that plans on bailouts. It has to be an organization that is innovative and really shows that it can transition into a post office of the future that not only provides services, but plays the crucial role that it must of universal access and connecting our people to one another.
Yeah, I'm going to have to insist on this question, Ms. Sangoni, because, as you said earlier, we have been here before. I'm making reference to a bailout. Now, I'd love a clear statement from your side. Does the post office need a bailout? Should it be bailed out?
There is no question that the post office requires a cash injection. And that cash injection is to the amount of 3.8 billion rand. Now, insofar as whether it should get such a bailout or not, those conversations have started. The department, led by Minister Malatsi, has been engaging with the National Treasury. And the National Treasury, as I said, has put very stringent measures or conditions for that cash injection to flow through to the post office. And again, I think as the portfolio committee, I want to emphasize that we are supporting the approach by the National Treasury, because you cannot have a situation where money is being poured into a bottomless pit and there is no very viable plan to turn the situation around. So insofar as the post office is able to deliver on the conditions of the National Treasury, then I think they must be supported, and they must also support us by showing us that they're able to turn the situation around in future.
So the reason I asked you that question was premised on what happened. I can't remember the exact year it was, but the former CEO of the South African Post Office, Mark Barnes, we're going to talk to him, in fact, tonight. He came forward and said, we're interested in buying the post office. So you talk about a bottomless pit where money from government continues to be poured into this, and yet there is no real value for that money. Why should the post office not be sold to interested parties?
You know, Oli, I don't think that when we are having challenges in our state-owned companies, we should have a knee-jerk reaction that defaults to whether you call it privatization or, a wholesale approach that requires the private sector intervention. What the post office is doing as part of their plans moving forward is to look for strategic partners, but not necessarily equity partners. I don't think that I have come across such a discussion thus far. So these partnerships, for example, would include, they have a partnership with Ethiopian Airlines to support them on cargo, which is one of the areas that we want the post office to grow in. And I think there's also a partnership where they've gone into a contract, for lack of a better word, where they are trying to leverage some of their property portfolio, and they're obviously working with private sector players in that regard. So there is a interest, there is a need for the post office to work with the private sector, but there are no discussions yet on the table on, privatizing any parts of the post office. Now, you ask why it is important that the post office remains in state hands. I indicated to you earlier that it's a very critical asset, and it is an asset that also carries the obligation to ensure that there is universal access to communication, particularly for our rural communities and our underserviced areas. They're working together with other parts of the department to ensure that they also extend that beyond what you usually had as traditional postal services, but going into the digital era, extending connectivity, free Wi-Fi spots in all of their branches. Now, we've already seen, in the telecom sector, for example, on issues of broadband, that once you leave such important obligations in the hands of the private sector, they're driven, and rightly so, I suppose, for them, by commercial motives, and you still have the state that has to come in and step in where they are unable to meet those service obligations that we require. Yeah. So this government is committed to ensuring that nobody is left behind, and the post office is a very important cog in our ability to deliver that.
Final question, I promise. You talk about this government, the 7th administration. If there's one thing that it does appear to be pushing quite strongly, are public-private partnerships. Would it be the solution here, you think?
Yes, definitely. And I think some of the examples that I was trying to make do speak to an appetite for public-private partnerships of one kind or another. I think in the case of the post office, according to the reports that have been given to the Portfolio Committee on Communications, such private partnerships really look to extending the reach of the post office. They look to, for example, on the issues of technology. I mean, we all know that the post office has very aged infrastructure, very old technologies that are still being used there. So looking for opportunities to partner, but also not leaving behind, I think, the SMME sector, historically disadvantaged people, looking at how you bring them into the value chain, particularly around last mile delivery. So there are innovations, and a lot of the innovation is coming from interested private sector partners, and those will be expanded, I think, and also I think they'll be judged on merit. The post office has identified the need for partnership to be an important part of their strategy moving forward.
Khusela Sangoni is the Portfolio Committee Chairperson on Communications in Parliament. Thank you very much for your time.